Hello, and a very warm welcome to this webinar from Finextra in association with ACI Worldwide and SWIFT. This is one in a series that we are doing together, and in this one we are focusing on preparing for 2020 and beyond. Where are we in the SWIFT GPI journey, and how can a bank benefit from SWIFT GPI? We've discussed previously and have seen rates of adoption to date, and we're now at a point to analyse that in more detail and start to see the path forward, see where the friction is, how it can be solved, and what exactly are the incentives for banks here to get fully involved and extend their global reach. Indeed, how do you extend beyond head office to the global network and universal confirmations? What is mandatory there and what is optional? And again, what are the benefits of the optional extras? So my name is Milne from Finextra, and joining me today, two panelists who will kindly share their insights and expertise on these questions and more. Daniel Lynch, who is involved with data analytics for compliance and payments innovation at SWIFT, and Adam Needel, Principal Solution Leader at ACI Worldwide. So they will each share some scene-setting opening remarks shortly. I'll hand over to them. But firstly, though, just a couple of things to bring to your attention. I'd like to draw your attention to some downloadable reading material on universal confirmation and also on the value of SWIFT GPI. So please do feel free to download these and read them at your leisure. Secondly, thanks for all of you for registering to listen today. And just to say that this will be available as an on-demand recording after 24 hours, so do share the link with any colleagues who may have missed out on today's session. And thirdly, you do have the facility to forward questions as we go through the discussion. So we'll endeavour to get to all of them and do encourage you to upload them, and we'll address them in due course as well as we can. So now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to my panelists, as promised, to set the scene for us and open the session. And Daniel, if I could ask you to lead on this, that would be great. Daniel, over to you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Big thanks to Finextra and ACI for inviting me to extol some of the virtues of some of the innovation initiatives that we're doing here at GPI. Always nice to give a little update to the community, so thanks again. I think is usually good to kick off with a little bit of a barometer around adoption, as that's usually the first question I hear from FIs, corporates, and vendors alike, right, as everyone's building roadmaps and thinking about the competitive landscape. I tend to characterize these in 4 buckets. Number 1, you have the adoption of the core GPI services. Number 2, thinking about how you can expose those services to your underlying customers. 3 is making sure everyone's updated on how SWIFT is evolving new features into GPI. And the 4th is sort of this waterfall of the tenets of GPI into becoming universal SWIFT values. I think we'll probably have a chance to talk at length about how these services are being leveraged and exposed to underlying customers, corporates, retails, other FIs today. So I think I'd probably begin with some of the more basic ideas about adoption. In terms of adoption of the core services, what we're seeing is increasingly instances of institutions where there's vanishingly little delta between traditional customer credit transfers and GPI. So we're thinking about like 95, 97, 98% rates of GPI instructed transactions with pretty open plans to reach 100 within the next 12 months. At the network level, we're hoping to reach across all institutions around 70% instructed payments by the end of this year. Additionally, it's not really just the Fin-SWIFT network stories. We've tried to really break out of that myopia because we understand that an end-to-end payments experience is going to involve some skips and jumps from SWIFT to other local clearing mechanisms. So we do see the onboarding of these local market infrastructures happily on both the instructing and instructed sides. So thinking about the states, that'd be like Fed, CHIPS, I believe in a panel I was on recently with the clearinghouse, they commented that something like 85% of CHIPS payments are an international leg by their estimation, and something like close to 84% were carrying the UETR. So really ensuring that there's adoption both on the SWIFT network and across anywhere a payment may be initiated or those end miles. I guess number 2 or 3, I forget how I characterized it, but in terms of new services, we're pretty pleased with the interest and the rapidity with which people are implementing. I think that's a testament to how, SWIFT has sort of stepped out of this, playing around in our lab or our ivory tower or whatever pejorative metaphor you want to use, to really co-creating a lot of these new services with our community. So ideating them together, sort of democratically voting on what the priorities are, what we should emphasize, and then rolling them out together with our customers in a more agile way. So I think the 3 I think folks have probably heard a lot about are our Instant service, the pre-validation API we're working on, and our case resolution service. So with Instant, we've been quite pleased to have done a number of successful trials. And again, breaking out of that myopia of not just trying to improve the experience on the SWIFT network, but the end-to-end initiation to credit story of a payment. We've done these tests both on the SWIFT network, but then also we're very happy to have worked with NPP in Australia, FAST in Singapore, and TIPS in Europe. Quite successful trials to the point where I think within the next 18 months, we'll probably see those coming into production. Pre-validation is one we've seen a lot of interest in. So this is the idea that you can pre-validate any details about a payment to ensure straight-through processing before initiation. Specifically, we've tried to focus on beneficiary account verification, as we know it is responsible for something like 50% of errors when you get like a Benny claims non-receipt, and hoping that we can improve that experience, both in terms of like cost reduction for the banks, but then also thinking about how you can expose it in your front end to satisfy customers from, like a retail person logging, weird esoteric bank details into a portal, getting alerts about, whether those details are correct or not, to whether you can expose that as an underlying API to your multi-banked institutions. We were really happy recently, actually, to about 20-something days ago, that of the dozens of institutions participating in this initiative, we actually saw live calls between Citi and BBVA doing these account verifications, and hopefully most of our institutions will be passing into full production together. Most of our participating institutions will be passing into production together in January. And then finally, we also have this sister initiative to the pre-validation, the case resolution service, where we've seen take up in our pilot group of the major application vendors of case resolution services, but also a lot of our largest intermediaries. So quite happy with that as well. But I think the last part of adoption that's always really key to focus in is SWIFT's intention to close the delta between what is GPI and what's expected of being a SWIFT member, right? So I think a lot of you folks are familiar with some of those evolutions we've done over the past 3 years. 2017, we had a pretty quiet one where we just asked that everyone can successfully consume a 103 that carries the UETR, such that our adopting institutions didn't have to pick and choose who they were instructing GPI to, but really do it according to their easiest onboarding plans. Last year, I think, was probably the one that folks were a little bit more cognizant of, as it took a little bit of development. That's where we universally instituted usage of the tracking reference, or UETR. So if you were sending a payment over SWIFT, you had to send it with the UETR. If you were an intermediary, you had to faithfully preserve it from the instructed 103 or customer credit transfer you received to the serial result as you forwarded on further. Obviously, tremendous value, because again, people ask me about adoption. You could say that some of our largest institutions are hitting 98%, 99% sent traffic, or that we're at like 70% of the network. But in reality, because of the institution of this universal tracking, 100% of payments are in fact trackable insofar as they are still on the SWIFT network, right? Next year is probably the most impactful in that we will be instituting universal confirmations. So any beneficiary institution, or as we say in the new ISO language, any creditor's agent, if folks want to get used to using that new nomenclature, all these beneficiary institutions will have to begin to provide credit confirmations. In fact, when they credit those end beneficiaries, that's of course going to bring a tremendous value in terms of providing settlement finality around these payments and clear visibility into the status of these instructed payments across the network. But we also recognize it's going to take some development. So to that end, we've been working with a lot of our great partners like ACI in ensuring that everyone can adopt that, right? And of course, we haven't decided yet, and we will do that, in concert with our board and our GPI members and our members broadly. But there's clearly an evolution here, right, where we see the usage of the UETR evolving to the universal confirmation. So it is highly probable that in the coming years we'll see things like maybe our stop and recall service or this pre-validation of beneficiary account details moving from the vanguard of GPI users into becoming a universal facet of using SWIFT and, planning around that and thinking that, yeah.
That's great, Daniel. Thanks so much. Great clarity there. Great scene setting. I love the points that you're converging it on around adoption, development, and this whole universal confirmation. Very compelling topic at the moment, of course, and so much to come back to you on as we go through the discussion and delve out a little bit more insight, and from Adam as well. So. Firstly, before we continue, it'd be great to hear from you, Adam, from your perspective in the field, as it were, some scene-setting opening remarks from your perspective. Adam.
Thank you very much. And Daniel, thanks for that great opening. I think it was spot on. So I think the value add I could do here is, how about the perspectives of what ACI, from ACI? To me, it's three areas. What is ACI hearing? What is ACI asked? And the perspective ACI always calls out in our conversations to either existing clients or new prospects. Let's start off with the first one. What is ACI hearing? RFIs and RFPs to the banks. I'm hearing more and more that everyone is stating, what is your level of GPI support to do it? We've even had a client that said that corporates are willing to walk away from an institution if they don't support GPI. It's becoming a de facto support of just running the system, not just saying I do SWIFT payments. We're hearing that prospects are stating, well, we're targeting to do or have done GPI in one location, such as your head office or the branch that has the biggest volume, but we haven't tackled it in all the other locations. And they're trying to figure out how to engage with that. And the last part is, as Daniel brought out, the universal confirmations that are coming out in 2020. We're hearing that for banks and institutions that are just either getting their feet wet with SWIFT or broadening their footprint, where they want to get involved in the universal confirmations because they see the value add that those give to the corporates on there as a stepping stone to GPI. And again, that would be for the people that are just getting started in the world of SWIFT or broadening their footprint. So as a result of what we're hearing, then ACI is asked, well, just like the customers are hearing RFPs and RFIs about what level of support, we're being asked, so what can you offer us around GPI, whether it's the fundamentals or the robust? People are saying we need a heavy footprint. We want to do a whole full replacement of our engine, of modernizing and doing there, or a light footprint. How can you help complement our existing engines to do GPI, whether it's doing the intraday work, whether it's how to do the value add of the tracker database, and again, the last aspect, how can you help us with universal confirmations? ACI rolled out the universal confirmations 13 months before the mandate in November 2020. Because as the partnering with SWIFT, we see the value add of of the confirmations, whether it's in GPI or Universal. So we wanted to make sure we could offer it to our existing customers. We even had a customer at Sybos that was discussing it on how they were rolling it out. And I think since Sybos, 2 other customers have asked, can you give us universal confirmations, which of course we can and are. And again, down the last one is the third aspect of what does ACI always do when we're having these conversations? We call out the value add of the SWIFT tracker, because SWIFT grabs all the data they see from the payments going across the globe, and it has a lot of robust information to use. But for the corporates, it's also helpful to append that data with more custom data. How can I make it where my corporate customers can make queries more in context of them, my own personal corporate reference, my own initiating endpoint, additional data that SWIFT might not have even seen yet or won't see at all. But nonetheless, look at them as, I see those all as overlay type services to the SWIFT tracker database. The perspectives we call out by doing GPI or doing universal confirmations, you reduce your calls to the call center. We give the power to the corporates to do the investigations themselves. And something Daniel and I always talk about all the time when discussing with customers and prospects, the tracker database is not just about where is my payment or what is the fees. It's how to be proactive. How can I look at my data and how can I change the way I'm doing my business to speed up my payments? How can I reduce the fees? And the last part that was called out to me that we always do is the world is going ISO. So it helps us remove the friction, as Daniel was noting about the GCCT Instant, of doing the interoperability between the schemes. Just removing that friction is a big deal and a strong value add. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. You've added a great deal there to Daniel's initial excellent groundwork, and just very interesting to hear how the questions are coming in from those who this explicitly affects. I can see we're going to get a lot of detail and give a lot of insight to the listeners as to what the specific services, overlay services are, where the value is, how to extract data they currently hold, add it to new data that's being gleaned, and just all the points around savings and speed and certainty. I mean, you've laid the groundwork for a fantastic further discussion. So thanks both very much for your scene setting there. And now, before we just delve into a little bit more detail, we've got some polling questions. It's always a great opportunity with so many listeners on board to get your thoughts live. So if we could just go first to the first question. It's one of 2. I'll ask my colleague to push it up to the screen. Question is, what stage are you at with your SWIFT GPI implementation? 4 options there to choose from: live at head office only, live at head office and internationally, signed up only, implementation project underway, or signed up only with an implementation strategy still being determined. So listeners, do encourage you to answer that question for us. It'll be very interesting to get a view, and then we'll discuss it shortly. It'll be up there for a couple of minutes. But straight back to your introductory comments, gents. And Daniel, perhaps to start with you first. You've touched on SWIFT's development of GPI. Great progress has been made. So we're just wanting to delve into how can we build on this? What would be a fair appraisal from your perspective of banks' adoption of GPI? How well advanced is it? And appreciating there's a fair way to go for some banks, how should the industry approach the problem of onboarding them, or the so-called long tail, as it were? Daniel.
Hey, yeah, sure. So just to table, I guess, for a moment, even thinking about the new services like pre-validation or case resolution, because I see those as really representing sort of like a paradigm change in terms of moving away from instructing payments in the form that's more similar to like a letter and moving to more like a chat where it's bi-directional and dynamic. Perhaps we can touch on that a little later to keep things a little more simple for some of the listeners, particularly those that are still adopting GPI or are in the process of implementation or considering it. I guess just thinking about the core service of, the tracking, same-day value, and increased SLA that we introduced a few years ago. If we want to zero in on that, I guess I'd mentioned previously that we're seeing impressive rates of adoption as far as payments being instructed as GPI, payments successfully being confirmed on the Benny side. But really, if you step back, that's essentially just adding a flag notifying that when you send a payment, it's a GPI payment, complying with a few SLAs, and not really thinking about what true adoption is. And that's how you expose this to your customers and how you extract value from these new processes. So to me, what's really interesting is how folks are taking this data and thinking about both who and how they're exposing it, right? On the how side, we're seeing a lot of interesting customer-facing developments on the front end. We now have dozens of institutions that are white labeling this tracking, such that an SME or another FI or even a person can self-service with like an unprecedented accuracy whenever we hear those four or three words, depending on how you hyphenate, beneficiary claims non-receipt, right? Now, on top of that, some institutions are doing really interesting stuff in terms of not just tracking payments or exposing that to their underlying customers, which is already, I think, immensely valuable. Again, we've seen, call center reductions of 50% in one case, even 90% once you expose this ability to self-service to your underlying customers. But other institutions, I think, are getting a little more creative in terms of taking this data, not just in-flight payments, but really the history of your payments and what you can do with that, right? So once, you can start analyzing this history, you can really look at the performance of your correspondents who previous to GPI, probably he didn't even know who they were, and a decent selection of your usual suspects as regard beneficiary banks in terms of their time to process a payment, the fees that they apply, their operating hours, et cetera, and really build interesting predictive analytics so that you can maybe start to implement optionality into your portals, right? Say maybe offering a customer the ability to optimize a payment on speed versus fee reduction or vice versa. On the who side, I think it's really about working throughout all your departments to fully realize these gains, right? So a lot of what I've just said in terms of white labeling tracking or even getting a little bit more creative, we see that categorically when we're talking about wholesale payments, but those are obviously not all the payments you send, right? So I started to think about the private bank, right? They occasionally send out some urgent payments for some pretty key customers. Well, why not roll out tracking to them, right? Or what about just retail, right? A lot of folks go through a lot of stress sending these payments, often with some urgency in terms of personal remittances. So why not give people the ability to track those payments and eliminate a little bit of that stress for folks? Of course, you start to get into interesting questions about what you expose when you get down into SMEs, micro business, retail, even the private bank, because a large corporate really, I think, understands a lot about payments and correspondent banking. Retail folks, you may be confusing them by giving them all these details, so you really need to decide what is ultimately going to help them reduce that stress, maybe just exposing that a payment is in flight and the beneficiary credit, for example. There's some other uses, I think, that you could even characterize even a little more creative. One thing that was certainly not something that we designed GPI to do, but is an obvious use case in retrospect, is I've heard a lot of anti-fraud departments beginning to use the tracker as like a golden record to reconcile against their back office, right? So it's completely independent of your back office, of your SWIFT interface. If you were to ever experience, like a hack or a malicious insider, we know that the modus operandi of a lot of these payments is that not only do you send out a fraudulent payment, but you try to erase any history of it happening. Well, now you have a golden record that you can reconcile against, right? I'm seeing network managers increasingly using the directory, which lists all the SWIFT GPI participants and their relevant currencies and clearing mechanisms, as well as our observer, which is sort of like the mechanism for ensuring good behavior on GPI. It's the report card of all the other institutions. I see them leveraging these two tools in order to, really more successfully, shop for better correspondence and such. I guess getting back to like the core wholesale payments proposition, it's worthwhile also to mention a live service we have, which is our GPI for Corporates initiative, which is much like GPI, a rolling, evolving initiative, where we're looking how we can more readily allow banks to easily generate these status messages for their corporate customers who are multi-banked. If corporate's on SWIFT, it's because they obviously prefer having a single window into payment initiation and statuses and statements around their cash positions versus portals. So we're looking at ways that we can more, easily enable that. So we worked with a lot of the core TMS and ERP providers in addition to the corporates and banks in developing this. And it's essentially allowing a corporate to create that UETR in their payment initiations rather than the bank, and then providing them all the relevant statuses so they can consolidate that in, their dashboards and such, right? So, just to emphasize, I think there's multiple waves of GPI adoption. One is just sending as GPI and following all the rules, and that's great, and we certainly support it. But the real benefit comes into how you start to expose the benefits of this data, both to your internal and external customers, and how you evangelize that cross-departmentally. That's I think the real interesting challenge once you're up and about running on GPI.
Yeah, I totally agree, Daniel, and thanks for all those insights there and points and creativity that you're illustrating that you're seeing and perhaps also suggesting to the banks and all the different verticals and everything. Clearly, they or some, I should be fair, some are struggling, however, to get to grips, and it's a significant development. So Adam, just in response to everything that Daniel said, and equally from a vendor perspective, working directly with the banks as you do in the way that you do, how do you see the way banks build a business case for this, justify the investment? What sort of approach are they taking? Some more strategic, perhaps, than others. How are you seeing the uptake in a bit more detail?
Sure, thanks. I call it for me, one of them is the NFR, customer retention. As I said earlier in my opening remarks, a lot of RFPs and RFIs are saying that corporates are willing to move to a different provider, different bank, if they don't have the offerings of GPI. So to me, we all know that having the deposits is where the value is for institutions on doing there and the traffic going through. So maintaining your customer base as well as gaining the customer base from other people that are not going to be doing GPI is the big pieces. Daniel already called it out about reducing the calls to the call center by giving people access to this data, the corporates. They're able to do their own investigations themselves, allowing the bank staff to focus on other aspects that takes a priority. And to be, I shouldn't say a priority, but adds value instead of just answering the questions that somebody could just do on their own. And to me, the last part is extending the GPI offering, as I said in the open remarks, extending it beyond the initial place of where you've done it to broaden it across all your branches across the globe. So like ACI, we offer two products, the GPI Connect, sort of a lightweight footprint, which appends to existing solutions, or RTPS, replacing and consolidating engines. GPI Connect being sort of like a mini orchestration hub of variety endpoints, allowing corporates to push data, to do updates, pull data, to do queries. As Daniel highlighted earlier, there's different services that are there and people need some information. The corporates were able to grab the data, make use of it, and apply it to different aspects of their business. With GPI Connect, it comes with our product of Gpi Data Service, which is mainly focused around data mining. But because the Connect complements an existing engine, a bank could be tactful and say, instead of doing the replacement, just put this in front of us, in between our engine and SWIFT, allowing us to become GPI enabled, as well as reducing the impact on all the other engines. And for banks that are doing modernization, with the world going ISO, with GPI being added to the payment tags for existing PAX messages, the 910s and the 199s and 299s going out, you were able to use the RTPS engine for replacing your engines. And if you're going across the globe or replacing, you can consolidate your engines into one. So it stems around customer retention and giving the power to the corporates for them to do the needs of there.
Excellent, thank you. So Daniel, anything to add to those remarks from Adam?
Yeah, I think it's a very useful thing to think about when you're implementing GPI is sort of this whole spirit and letter of the law distinction in terms of like the GPI rulebooks. It's been great to work with a lot of partners such as ACI, and that when you are implementing as an intermediary, the expectation is that you can process a payment instantaneously, and the rulebook states like within 4 hours, right? And for a beneficiary bank, we'd like same day processing and updates to the tracker. But obviously, the evolution and the expectation is that if you can do it in real time, like intraday, that is where we'd like to see things going across both those sort of intermediary flows and Benny legs of payments. And as I noted before, there is this steady evolution of things that are more the vanguard of GPI becoming base expectations of GPI members and later SWIFT participants. So, really, working with your back office architecture and providers to try to make it to that endpoint, I think is the ultimate goal you should be working towards, yeah?
Indeed, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. In many ways, it's a no-brainer, but I suppose it just takes a little while for these massive global branch networks and institutions to sort of bring it on board. Just want to go to the polling question and to have a look at those answers there and see what we think about those, because I'm sure that you will have had sight of similar questions earlier in the year, guys, and it'd be interesting to see, what the difference is now. So I'll just read them out. I think everyone can see them, but the results are as follows. What stage are you at with your SWIFT GPI implementation? So live at head office only was 11.6%. Live at head office and internationally was an encouraging 29%. Signed up only, implementation project underway, let's call that 23%, and signed up only with implementation strategy still being determined, now that's a 37%. So any quick and immediate thoughts and responses to those results? Adam?
Well, it looks like here that we're seeing people looking at the head office only, going at it from, like we talked about earlier, the initial one focusing on the area that does the most robust and the complex of the payments, and then deciding later to branch out to their other branches, just doing it in integral steps of there.
Yeah.
It is definitely nice to see the head offices and international growing up. The signed up on those aspects is what we heard repeatedly is people know they want to do it in some regards in the process of doing it, as they wanted to see how other people were doing things and focusing on some of the ISO work first, and then other parts of deciding how to do it and reaching out and getting some fact finding from there. That's pretty much what I see from that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Daniel, anything quickly to add to that? I mean, I suppose Adam's pretty much summed it up.
Yeah, no, that was excellent, Adam. Also, of course, part of my job is tracking this monthly, so these answers don't surprise me.
Yeah. Sure, I'm sure. Okay, great. We are getting a lot of questions in, which is great to see. I know that we're covering quite a lot of them in the course of discussion, and we can certainly look to respond to anyone whose question we don't get to post webinar. But we're just over halfway through, and we've still got quite a lot to cover. And it'd be great just to talk now in greater detail about universal confirmations. So, you know, it's a huge aspect of the planning for organizations. So surely there's a decision to be taken here. How much development and cost is consumed in meeting the deadline for universal confirmation, as opposed to the incremental effort to be prepared fully for GPI, and how do you both view this? So Daniel, perhaps you first on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I'd largely emphasize, I guess, the split between correspondents that serve a mix of corporates, retail, and other FIs with, who represent the bulk of payments, and then respondents who more strictly serve corporates and retail people who represent the bulk of participants, banks in the world, right? And in terms of where this fits into their calculus around GPI adoption. For the correspondents, I would say that, I'd mentioned earlier, a lot of them are reaching the sort of full GPI status, right, where they're increasingly sending, 98, 99% of their payments instructed as GPI. Those last few percentages and those that aren't with that level of adoption are certainly thinking about, using this universal confirm initiative as a justification for reaching that 100%. For respondents, again, those institutions that are really just serving the corporates and retails and such, I would encourage an analysis of the delta between this universal confirm initiative and the adoption of GPI. Now, SWIFT, part of the mechanism design that we've employed here in terms of ensuring that there are incentives to folks adopting the service is we sort of this karma principle, and that we're going to make sure that folks get what they give. So whether you join GPI or not, you're going to be able to log into a portal and query the confirms of your outbound payments as long as you provide payments. And that's for any SWIFT member, right? So that's part of sort of the virtuous cycle of participation in this new evolving SWIFT network. That said, additionally, I should mention, we're giving folks the ability to sort of point and click if they're a very low volume user to provide those confirms, right? So ensuring that they have a way that they can easily provide the confirms and then get something in return as an incentive, i.e. the tracking of the confirmation of their outbound payments. That said, that probably covers a few thousand institutions, and then there's still probably a good, 1,200 left in the respondent community. Quite large banks sometimes within their relative geographies, maybe regionals, super regionals. Here in the U.S., I think about folks that serve a number of states, and LATAM, maybe the prime, or Latin America, where I work as well, maybe the primary bank in a country, or maybe a bank that has ambitions to serve a number of banks or countries in the region. I think it's very worthwhile to do an analysis of if you're going to do the work of implementing the universal confirms from your back office, if you've essentially done maybe 95% of what it takes to be a GPI member, why not do that extra 5%, i.e. provide that same day value and the transparency on fees, such that you can really begin to tap into some of the benefits that I spoke about before, that you can expose to your underlying customers in more exciting ways than, having your service department, log into a portal and seeing an any confirm. Rather, get those more advanced statuses across all of your intermediaries and beneficiary institutions that you're working with, and leverage that data for more, satisfying experiences for your customers. So I know it's an exercise that's not going to be easy for every institution, but I would really suggest thinking about, as the lowest common denominator of SWIFT membership is rises, I guess would be the verb there, thinking about why not really take advantage of this initiative and, satisfy, again, all these internal and external customers.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daniel. Just before I bring Adam's comments in to your remarks and how he sees universal confirmation, I almost said universal credit there. That's an entirely different thing in the UK. I just want to draw the listeners' attention to the second polling question. That's all, as to how you are implementing. Why you are implementing SWIFT GPI. So we've got 5 or 6 different responses there. Some of you have already started, but just to draw everyone's attention to that. So swiftly back, excuse the pun, to what we were talking about. So Adam, your comments, your remarks, your responses, please, to what Daniel's just said there about planning for universal confirmations and the cost element and the effort involved. Comments from you, Adam.
Sure, thanks. So for one part, let's do it from the perspective of ACI let me say it differently. From what the customers or prospects are looking from ACI related to universal confirmations. To us, do they want a heavy footprint or a light footprint on replacing something? But ACI looks at it as 99% of, if you're doing GPI, for the fact that we already had rolled out GPI, we already had universal confirmations. All we had to do is tweak and adjust our existing offerings to do it. So our offerings to the customers give them both the choices of how they want to either complement what they have today, meaning their existing engines, or again, part of the whole modernization. I want to, the fact universal confirmations are coming out, the world going ISO, the modernization of everything occurring, this is a good time to begin the step forward in my journey of replacing my engines and consolidating. And with such a feat, whether it's a heavy footprint or whether they're saying I want to use complement what I have today, then we would offer our light offering to support the universal confirmations. So with that, as Dana already noted, you really want to analyze the overlap of if I was going to do GPI or not, what is my business? If you're already doing so many interactions to your various backends for universal confirmations and it's a 5 or 10% difference, you should just go right to GPI on doing there. But then we have also heard with SWIFT and us talking to customers, we're hearing banks and FIs out there our engines are more batch oriented. We're not really designed for intraday responses, and that's the perfect examples where universal confirmations could be a good piece of doing it, creating batch files of batch confirmations, where SWIFT says, hey, if you can do it either a predefined CSV file, you hand it on our SWIFT interface, we'll absorb that and automatically feed into the SWIFT tracker. If a bank is using a third party to talk to SWIFT, you could leverage stuff with ACI where we'll take the batches and do the updates to the SWIFT tracker for you. It's the overlap, really, and that's just, to me, is the net piece. How much do I need to do universal confirmations? What's my delta for GPI? And if it's such a small amount, I recommend always going just right to GPI. And again, it goes to the fundamental leveraging the NFR customer retention of those aspects.
That's great advice there. Great clarity. Thank you very much. I think everyone will very much appreciate what you're saying, and it sort of hints to the greater benefits of sort of the rerouting possibilities and cost savings perhaps as well. But I'd like to delve now into the sort of wider benefits around overlay services, because of course that's a huge incentive around all this, and where some great value add can be brought in. So Daniel, how, in simple terms, well, simple question, how do these overlay services add value?
Yeah, so again, I'd characterize always that there's sort of two types of overlay services. They're the ones that SWIFT is developing at the behest of the community, and then there's the ones that banks are creating in their own labs, leveraging what GPI can enable without us necessarily building it. So I talked a little bit earlier about using the data to optimize for, speed versus fee reduction, or creating new anti-fraud tools or new services for your corporates. I think there's really a sort of treasure box to play with when it comes to even just the base data flowing out of the tracker. And we see banks doing really interesting things, banks and other institutions as well. Now, when it comes to what SWIFT is rolling out in terms of overlay services, again, just emphasizing the process that we use to create these. We've really evolved away from, I love the folks in product management at SWIFT. I love the folks in marketing. I worked in those two departments. But I think the valuable distinction often with GPI is the deep engagement with the community, where we ideate and co-create together, right? So each year, I always like to tell the story because I think it's very illustrative of why GPI has been so successful, particularly as we evolve it into new places. We do these workshops with our participants. Initially, it was like the 15 that created GPI. Today, with hundreds of institutions, we've found that there's probably some scale issues with getting everyone together into one room. So throughout the year, we conduct a number of regional workshops for North America. We'll do one in like New York. Maybe we'll do one in Miami or somewhere in Latin America. We hit Shanghai, Istanbul, go to Brussels, go to London. Get these participants together, banks, but also non-bank FIs, some broker-dealers, investment managers, custodians, money service bureaus, PSPs, and everyone gets together and really starts to lay out where those pain points are. And, if initially the goal was to mitigate a lot of friction in cross-border payments, we've sort of upped the ambition to trying to eliminate a lot of these points today. Together, we vote as these regional workshops, and then graduate up the functions and initiatives that we think will be most helpful to mitigate and eliminate these payments. That's how, for instance, stop and recall a service for irrevocably stopping an in-flight payment was born out of those 2017 meetings. 2018 is how a lot of these new services that I'm particularly excited about were born. Again, the three that are most exciting, closest to the horizon, and even, honestly in production amongst a limited series of participants are these pre-validation, case resolution, and instant services. Again, it's really thinking about, particularly with pre-validation, how we can take that ambition up into fully eliminating friction in payments. Again, we've started with beneficiary account verification, such that we can roll this out into real use and value for our customers and our customers as soon as possible. And because we know that something like 5 to 7% of payments are failing because of lack of these data, correct beneficiary data. It generally costs something like 25 to 35x to repair these payments. So we're talking about a cost that's roughly equivalent to all of your STP payments generated by these issues. And then just forgetting the internal costs and issues, it's really about customer satisfaction. We want to have ways to make, cross-border payments a little less Byzantine for people. We want an SME or a micro business or a retail person to be able to just, get into their bank portal, type a few simple, pieces of data or numbers, and have all that validated for them before they get hit with all those repair fees and issues. Additionally, at the the more core level in terms of wholesale, thinking about how a bank could expose these APIs in a derivative fashion to their underlying investment managers, corporates, folks that are a little bit more sophisticated, right? And it's really interesting, I think, to think about that. And then case resolution, which is very similar API and message-based initiative for solving a problem with a payment, but when it's already in flight, right? Where you need to reach back across correspondence and find the date of birth of a debtor, if they have an incomplete address, if there's a missing field or payment purpose code, sort of correcting all that information in flight. I think it's a really interesting evolution, again, because payments for thousands of years have really functioned a lot more like a letter. I mean, anyone who works knows that, like, if anyone who works with folks who work in other time zones know how hard it is to get something done when you have to send an email, and because you don't have a coincidence of time zones, maybe the simplest question may take 3 or 4 days to answer because it's just one way, send an email. I'm sorry, can you clarify? Okay, we lose another 24 hours. Whereas when you can chat with one of your colleagues in person or over like an instant message, you can really resolve these things quickly. So we really are excited about evolving the payments process from something that's a letter to something that's more like a conversation, something that's less like an email and more like a chat, and making it as easy as possible to not just use this internally, but really leverage it in your front ends to satisfy all types of eventual customers, be they from the world's largest corporations to the world's least payment savvy person trying to pay, send a remittance to a family member or help their kids studying abroad, make sure they get their textbooks, right?
Yeah. Excellent. Brilliant. Again, such great detail there. And it's what I really like is you've illustrated so clearly the collaborative sort of imperative here on creating and implementing these overlays. So Adam, it would be great to get your perspective, how banks are actually deploying such overlays, such as the pre-validation and the global customer credit transfer.
Yeah. So Daniel clearly articulated, the biz industry and the use cases for doing all the overlay services. So our role at ACI is to bring that to the market to everyone up there. So, we're doing it in a few different ways. One of them is the data service, being able to grab the data from the SWIFT tracker, pulling it down, allowing people to add all their proprietary data to each message, showing the traffic to SWIFT or something SWIFT hasn't seen, or maybe it went a whole different path, but following the same mindset. Doing the Gpi Connect, which again comes with the data service, allowing to support the pre-validation calls or other APIs that Daniel was calling out that SWIFT is offering. Because again, it's not just about where is the payment and where are the fees, but how to improve the works going forward. Also folding pre-validation into our RTPS product were relevant, where granted 99% of the pre-validation calls will be coming from the corporate front end places, but trying for ACI to insert it where it's needed into RTPS where relevant. And then the fact again of the friction, removing the friction wherever possible. I like to stress the part about the GCCT Instant. Of doing a cross-border payment, submitting it into an instant payment scheme or faster payment or immediate payment scheme, depending where you are in the world, what term is used, supporting the whole continuous flow. So with ACI offering our RTPS footprint, the data service, the connect, the pre-validation call, which we called out specifically here in hindsight of this webinar, but how it folds into the Gpi Connect and the RTPS payment service. Removing the friction, giving the power to the corporate customers, giving the power to the call centers to be able to do work and answer questions when they are getting them. That's where we see the value and how we bring it to the customers to make use of the overlays SWIFT is offering. So I'm being a little conscious of the time, so I think I'll just stop there and give this back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got about six minutes left. And on your final point is kind of interesting just to point out that the top answer for the reasons that the listeners are implementing SWIFT Gpi is that the key solution for modern day payments. It is, you could conceive that as it is the way forward. It is certainly part of the way forward, but also interestingly and encouraging me again to improve my customers' experience through transparency of data. So, people are really on board with the end goal of leveraging the data, and it's not just, to remain competitive, which is thankfully quite a low response. That said, let's move through to some final thoughts from you both, and how this journey will roll out over the next 12 months as we reach the 2020 deadline for universal confirmations and beyond. How do you see it rolling out? So just perhaps a couple of minutes each just to wrap up with a future outlook. So Daniel, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, so I had mentioned this whole, global customer creation thing we do. We're still wrapping up 2019's input and getting our users together to sort of vote on what we're going to prioritize next year. So apologize that I can't really give you a great 12-month answer besides coming soon, and probably very soon, as in the spring. We'll decide what individual sort of features that we're going to roll out to GPI and, new capabilities. Two things I can always say, though, because we've really validated with the community and committed to doing are, number one, we really want to develop a strategy for enabling folks to enable their customers via, more easily implementable sort of plug-and-play front-end capabilities. So, some institutions can design brilliant front-end experiences for tracking. Others can't. Sometimes some can in wholesale, but they don't have the budget for retail or the private bank, as I mentioned before. So really coming up with more interesting sort of plug-and-play capabilities as far as tracking, the pre-validation, the case resolution, not just for your back office consumption, but how you can expose it to these corporates, retails, other FIs that are your customers, right? So that's something that we're always working at and hoping to evolve over the next few years, such that the evolution of GPI is not just asks, such as using the UETR or providing the confirms, but real benefits universally accessible to all of our members. The second that we're always looking at and probably going to evolve significantly over the next few years is using this tracking reference, or UETR, to tie to underlying transactions, because payments ultimately don't happen I don't pay somebody for no reason. I'm paying somebody for some type of real-world activity. So using that as a key to a series of metadata values about payment purposes, right? So on the SWIFT network, we're always looking at, if we can start to use this UETR in FX confirmations, letters of credit, securities where applicable. It's a little tougher because of omnibus accounts, but tying these activities to their payments. And then sort of outside of the SWIFT world, seeing if we can collaborate to tie the tracking reference to things in the supply chain and procure to pay world, such as a purchase order or a shipping notice or an invoice, such that payments are not just trackable and accurate, but also filled with a lot of rich metadata about their underlying purpose. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And over to Adam now for a couple of final closing comments from you. What would you suggest would be the main considerations for banks to take into account to fully reap the benefits? Closing key piece of advice from you, Adam.
Yeah, to be conscious of the time, I'll just be pretty succinct. One part is with the world going ISO, how everybody's going to be making so many changes, is how can you fold in nicely supporting the ISO with GPI all as seamlessly as possible, all in the same project. I think a lot of people are going to be spending the time on. Then as well, doing that, people are going to be like, okay, what are the deltas of being the deltas as far as effort to roll in universal confirmations versus GPI, I think is the second aspect. And with those two topics all being done, people are going to be looking at their solutions, and as it was called out in the polling questions as well, is the when do I want to modernize and tackle that on with the other two aspects of that and find the right priority order. I think that's what's going to be in 2020 as well as 2021 for everybody. And, I have to say again of, trying to leverage if possible, even the offerings that ACI was, that we the offerings that ACI has to help people with that, whether it's a full footprint or a light footprint. And back to you.
Thanks so much, Adam. And to your point, we do have a final question there on receiving further advice from our expert speakers. So that means it's a wrap, pretty much. I can't thank you enough. You've shared such an incredible amount of insight and detail there, and there's really such a phenomenally hopeful future outlook in the benefits that are still to be carved out, that are already being leveraged and still to be carved out, all around data and speed, all around visibility, certainty, control, leading to cost savings and new revenue streams. So it is a very exciting development. Thanks very much, listeners, for tuning in. We will get to your questions that we haven't been able to address, and all that remains to say is have a lovely rest of the day.